Welcome to my next video. I'm going to do another platter. This time I'm going to use this piece of square oak. I'm going to make a square platter. I'm going to mount it in a little bit different way also. I'm going to use a glue block and what's called a paper joint, which is something used with craft paper, a little bit of glue, and this will allow me to be able to drill for my screw chuck to about any depth I need to go without too much concern about thickness. Paper joints are nice because they are easily disconnected, but they hold very, very substantially while they're in use. So, screw chuck technique, glue block, works great for thin projects also. This one's not so thin. And a piece of grocery store paper bag. A little glue. Let's get started. I'll show you how to do it. Well, here's our piece of oak. I cut it as square as I could so that I can connect the corners and locate the dead center. It's about a full 3/4 of an inch thick, so that's a nice piece of wood. Now here's the glue block, which I've also cut as square as I could, and I'm also marking its corners and locating its center. Purpose of which is to be able to align these two pieces as a glue joint a little later on. Sort of like that. So next thing we're going to do is take that piece of craft paper. This is a grocery store bag. I may be a little anal in marking the size of it, but I just did. So we trimmed that to about the size we need. And I'm going to glue it together with the glue block. And I'm going to use their standard yellow glue. This is Tite Bond Original. And just put a little layer on. And I'm going to stick that to the glue block. A little pressure to spread the glue. Hold it in place while I put some on the other side. And now I'll glue the two together just with a little bit of finger pressure. It doesn't take much. But I am lining up the lines so that that glue block is as close to the center as it can get it. After a little while, the glue's dry. We're ready to go on with the project. Since I have a fairly large glue block, it's not necessary for me to measure the depth of the hole as I did in the last project. So I just drilled my 3/8 hole that will be used for the screw chuck, which is the way I'm going to mount this project, just like the last time. Screw chuck's inserted into the 4-jaw chuck. This is a one-way Talon chuck. It's the brand that I'm using. And we'll just screw that piece on. The glue block is a piece of cross-grain poplar, which should take threads very nicely. And it's stiff enough that it won't tear out as I tighten this piece down against the face of the jaws. We want it solidly against the face so we have a nice, rigid, and flat alignment. Done the best we can in getting aligned, but as we make these first couple of passes with the tool, you can hear a little bit of chattering in the background, and that's because the wood isn't 100% flat. And a couple of pull cuts across here will take care of that. Now the only area I'm really interested in is this area right in the center, because that's going to be the bonding surface when we flip the piece around. The wings that I'm cutting on right now, or what will be the wings, will be turned down anyway, so it's not necessary really to get it flat all the way out to the rim. When I make my cuts, I'm trying as best possible to keep my fingers against the tool rest. The tool rest is set as parallel as I can to the face of the wood. And if my finger's right against the edge of the tool rest, then I can run the tool horizontally at the same depth of cut all the way across. So I try really hard to keep my fingers against that. Well, I've measured the diameter of the closed jaws on the chuck before I started to establish what that dimension is going to be into which I'm going to expand the chuck jaws later. So that's that. And I'm also marking off what I think is going to be the size of the foot of the piece. So I have both of those laid out. It's my process to use the tip of a skew chisel to cut that groove. I want to go in absolutely straight because I want that side wall to be vertical, perfectly vertical, with a very clean corner at the bottom. So the skew going in with the toe first, moving horizontally just as to create some working room for the tip of that tool. I'm going for 1/8 of an inch depth, and that's all I need. And once I've established it in that corner, I then will go back in with another tool and just remove the unnecessary wood in the middle of the project. The jaws I'm using on the chuck require a straight groove. Other brands might require a dovetail. So I'm going to use a shallow fluted gouge simply because I can get in there easily right next to that shoulder and take out the mass in the center. All I'm trying to do is get it flat across there. I'll take out the material with the shallow fluted gouge, and we'll clean it up as best we can because this is an area that will get finished right at this point. As in the last project, this is an area that we will not be going back to work on a second time. So we'll clean it up, get it good and flat, get the surface cleaned and sanded, and decorated. A few scraping cuts across here just to take care of any anomalies in my cutting. Now, sanding is a little difficult, mainly because it's right at the center of rotation. And while the wood is moving, it's moving around in circles and not necessarily helping me with my sanding. So I've got to keep the paper moving as I work this area. And it's going to take a little bit more time than it would even further out because of the wood movement. So we'll do the same thing. We'll go through all the grits and get it as smooth as we can. Now, on the other platter I put a number of lines on the bottom as a decorative mark, and I used a diamond point tool to do it and just spaced them by eye. I've been asked how to get them perfectly aligned, so here's a different way. I'm going to take a beading tool. This happens to be a D-way tool, and I'm going to just use the corners of the beading tool to put 2 marks. And then I'll move the tool over and rest the right wing of the tool in the first mark while cutting with the left wing just to create a line. And this way I can space these circular marks perfectly. Just another way to do it. Well, that's cleaned up. So now increase the speed just a little bit, and we're going to start working on the wings. Sorry about some of the camera shots that you're going to see in the next couple of minutes. The camera has a hard time trying to decide what is in focus and what is not. So it sees solid wood, then it sees air, and then it sees solid wood, and it gets really confused, just like I do when I'm cutting something like this. So getting your light arranged perfectly so that you can see the shadow of that wing as it comes around would be really helpful. So play with your lights and your viewing angle so that you can see that. A few later shots you'll be able to see some of the shadows of that as it comes around, and not so much in this one right here. So I start my cuts on the solid wood where I can position the tool against the solid wood, get the flute in the right position, and then lean back, straight back, trying to remove the wood fibers. if I can keep my body moving straight, I will cut right into that air gap very cleanly. So keeping my fingers on this side of the tool rest for sure, and keeping my body position aligned will help. Now this is a pull cut. I'm laying the bevel of the tool against the solid wood, establishing where the cut needs to be, and then just leaning back without moving the tool in any rotational way at all. High speed, sharp tools, good lighting are all important when you do a project where there is air gaps. I'm taking very light cuts. I'm taking my time at this. Stopping and checking, you can see that we've made good progress towards the corners. The shape between the corner and the penciled line needs to be curved in the way that I want, and so I'm going to spend more time removing solid wood to create that shape. Now I'm going to show you a couple of different cuts that you can use in doing this project. You've seen that. You can almost hear the sound of the tapping as it comes right out to that edge. Now here I have the tool fully closed and the bottom wing is touching the wood fibers. The top wing is proud of the surface. We want to keep the bottom wing in touch and the top wing not in touch. And this is a shear scraping action. Fairly safe way to remove small amounts of wood in this kind of situation. Scraping, shearing, scrape. You can see the shape beginning to evolve. The corners are coming around just fine. Now I'm going to do some sanding. And there's some tricks to sanding in a situation like this. I'm going to start off with a strip of sandpaper. And it works pretty good where there is air gaps, but the trick is that the bottom edge of the sandpaper touches the wood. The top edge is proud of the surface. If you let the top edge touch, there's a high probability that the corner coming around will grab that paper and jerk it out of your hands. So drag the paper along the bottom edge only, and that will work with sanding. Now difficulty here is I'm working with oak, and oak has a tendency to be difficult to get sanding marks out of. And the strip could have worked, but it didn't. And as you can see, as I'm sanding with the grain, trying to take those circular marks out, I'm not being very successful. So while this might be a good finish way, it's not the one I need right now. So I'm going to go to power sanding, and with the lathe turned off, I can work on just specific areas where I have grain problems showing. And after some time and going through 2 or 3 different grits, we finally got most of the circular marks removed. This technique works fairly well. There are other techniques that we can also use in situations like this, and I'll show you another one. So randomizing the scratch pattern some more, I'm using a reciprocal sander, and again you can see the back edge is touching the wood and the front edge, or the top edge in this case, is away from the surface. It rotates, though, therefore creates randomized scratch patterns, and I can bring that all the way out to the wing, but always keeping the top edge of the tool away from the surface. You can see I'm sanding all the way out on the end of the wing there, and you can actually see the shadows of those wings coming around. So that technique is another one that you can try. We got it pretty well done on that side. It's time to move forward and reverse the piece and begin to work on what will be the face of the platter. So unscrew it, And there's several instances where you could take the glue block off. And I've decided to go ahead and mount the platter onto the 4-jaw chuck and then take off the paper jointed glue block. So I'm pressing tightly against the chuck while I'm expanding the jaws into that recess. I want to be sure it is going onto the chuck jaws as square as I can possibly get it. Pressure, expansion, good solid joint. So here's how I take it off. Just take a bench chisel flat against the plate, and I'm using a rubber mallet, giving it a few blows, and it just splits right down the center of the paper. You can see there's craft paper left on the project and craft paper left on the glue block, which I just set aside. Now that can be turned away easily when we get ready to do it. But I'm going to do something else for safety. I'm taking a piece of tape and I'm putting on the edge of the tool rest. Now what that is doing is marking where the end of the wing occurs. So I now know, if I can't see it, I know where it's supposed to be, and I don't put my finger there. So I'm checking the markings on the backside where the size of the foot was defined. I'm going to transfer that to the face. So now I know from that point outward is going to be wing. And again, I'm starting to cut with the tool resting on solid wood, rolled open until I get the cut started. My fingers against the tool rest to keep the depth of the cut about the same. And there's that camera stuff I couldn't control. You'll see another bad shot like that. I can fix that in the future videos. Now here I'm laying the flute wide open. Back edge of the tool is against the wood, and I roll it counterclockwise until I engage the edge. Then I push forward. I started on the shadow, and I'm working into the solid wood. I could have started on the solid wood and worked outward into the shadow. Here's a better view. Now there's a shear scraping cut. It's a full cut. The bevel's riding against the wood. I could take that all the way to the wing, and you can see the shadow of the wing barely in this picture here. Camera angle seems to support this one pretty well. A lot of wood needs to be removed towards the center as I need to drop the height of that wing area. High speed, sharp tools, good lighting. All keys to being able to do projects like this. So by finger, I'm feeling that there's more mass that needs to be removed. Tool is wide open, the back is touching the wood, and I'm turning it counterclockwise until I get that first little bit of sawdust. And there's my cut, and I'll keep that angle all the way in to the end of that cut. It's great if you can make the cut from wing to the bottom in one pass. You'll have less sanding marks that need to be taken out later. I'm turning the tool fully upside down here to do a shear scrape. Another cut that you can try. I'm working on the solid wood mainly because there's a spot in there I wanted to take more mass away from. And I'm going to use the tool now as a bowl turning tool. And I'm simply going inside and turning, let's call it a little bowl. This is the shallow portion of the plate. Turn the tool upside down and pushing straight down, so I wanted to create a straight shoulder on the outside of that bead-like area. And now I've turned the tool wide open because I need to get that little corner in there taken away. And this is being done with the shallow fluted gouge because of the ability of it to reach into these spots. A little shear scraping on the top, a little shear scraping on the side, simply to get the shape where we like it to be. You notice in the center of my platter there's a little mountain of wood that hasn't been removed. It's a good trick to leave that to the very last. Therefore you know how far down you've turned by measuring from the top to the bottom of the platter. Now I've chosen just to leave it anyway, maybe as a little decorative mark. Power sanding, reciprocal sanding, and at the very end a piece of sandpaper, bright light, sanding with the grain of the wood to take out any remaining circular sanding marks that might still be there. Sanding a piece sometimes takes every bit as long as turning. So when I get all that done, I happen to have a vacuum chuck on my lathe, so I was able to hold this piece on the vacuum chuck, completing the bottom of the bottom. I turned it around, it's on the vacuum chuck. I'm blending those two surfaces together. If you didn't have a vacuum chuck, you would find a little block of wood pressed against those circles, being held in place by the tailstock while that edge was cleaned up. So power off, vacuum chuck, and the plate comes right away. If you don't have one and invest in creating one, you'll find it to be an accessory that you use very frequently. So to clean up the project, I've just decided to use a little bit of Minwax wipe on poly. I'm going to soak it into the oak. The oak will take up a lot, and I'm just going to soak it as best I can. It's going to create a nice finish. It will seal it. It will provide, obviously, the color of the wood coming out. And I'm going to let it take on as much as it possibly can. It'll soak it in, it'll seal the fibers, it gives it a nice look. Catching the edges as well as the face and the back. And when I get it loaded up, I will take a blue shop towel and simply wipe off the excess. As soon as that's done and it's dry, I might put a coat of paste wax on it, just simply to protect it. There it is. Well, we're back. We finished the square platter. Came out pretty good. There's some things I could have done better. One thing is I wasn't keeping the lathe speed as high as I could. The slower speeds made for a little rougher cut and a lot more time spent sanding. I left a mountain in the center just as a decorative item, but most people would like to take that out. The idea of this mountain is to leave it there until the very end. That will allow you to see how far down you've turned the bowl before you cut this away. So I could have worked more with high speed. I did put a piece of tape on the tool rest to allow me to know exactly where the corner of the platter was. If I had my fingers in the wrong place, I could very easily have broken a finger against a piece of wood that I didn't even see. Well, it was a fun project. I hope you give it a try to a square platter. I think it's a fun project to try. We'll see you in our next video. Thanks for viewing.